Hello, everybody, and welcome to Lecture 6 in this Grammar and Style series relating to legal writing online. So what will we discuss in this lecture? We're talking about parallel structure, bias-free language, and punctuation. So parallel structure. What does this mean? Parallel constructions. We have a series of like sentence elements. This is common. But every element of a parallel must match. And it needs to serve the same grammatical function. So what does this mean? I think it's easiest to look at some examples in the Chicago Manual of Style. So, not so good. She did volunteer work in the community kitchen, the homeless shelter, and taught free ESL classes offered by her church. So in this sentence, what I would usually do is split up the parallel items to check to see if we have the best parallel construction. So where do we make these separate sentences? So for example, she did volunteer work in the community kitchen. That's fine. So then we say she did volunteer work in the homeless shelter. That's fine. So now we kind of think after in is where the kind of parallelism starts. So then we would say she did volunteer work in taught free ESL classes offered by her church. Doesn't work. So we don't have good parallel structure. We have poor parallel structure. So how can we fix that? So she did work in the community kitchen. That's fine. She did work in the homeless shelter. That's fine. But now we need to change this next part. And one way to do it would be to say she did volunteer work in her church, right? So the whole sentence would be something like, she did volunteer work in the community, in the homeless shelter, and her church, where she taught free ESL classes. So another example, a poor example. The candidate is a former county judge, state senator, and served 2 terms as attorney general. So, where are the 3 sentences in this example? The candidate is a former county judge. Okay, that's fine. The candidate is a state senator. And third, the candidate is a served 2 years as attorney general. That doesn't work. So what we would need to do is change that third clause around, the third element, to make it parallel with the first 2. So what a better approach would be is to say the candidate is a former county judge, state senator, and 2-term attorney general. So here we have the candidate is a former county judge, the candidate is a state senator, and the candidate is a 2-term attorney general. That's fine. So now we have good parallel structure. The only criticism I would have in this sentence would be, does former modify only county judge, or are all these formers? Likely not. Well, it could be. So, for example, are we saying the candidate is a former county judge, the candidate is a former state senator, the candidate is a former two-term attorney general? Or is it saying the candidate is a former county judge, currently a state senator, and two-term attorney general? I think the meaning here would be former, all of them. But just be aware when you draft that you have this parallelism in mind. So prepositions and parallel structure. In this situation, you have to use a preposition in each element unless all the elements use the same preposition. So examples. A poor sentence would be, I'd like to either go into business for myself or else to write freelance travel articles. So what would be better is I'd like either, one, to go into business for myself or else to write freelance travel articles. So eliminating that first two. Another example of a poor element. Our guests not only ate all the turkey and dressing, but both pumpkin pies as well. So here you would have to, you think the sentence is not only but also, right? The ate needs to go before the not only. Why? Because they ate all the turkey and dressing, and they ate both pumpkin pies as well. So the sentence would need to read, our guests ate not only all the turkey and dressing, but both pumpkin pies as well. Sorry, now let's go back to prepositions in parallel structures. A couple of examples. I looked for my lost keys in the sock drawer, the laundry hamper, the bathroom, and under the bed. So now we have the first three, we're using the preposition in, right? I looked for my lost keys in the sock drawer, in the laundry hamper, in the bathroom, and under the bed. So in this example, we would have to include the in. And auxiliary verbs in parallel structure. So if you have an auxiliary verb before a series of verb phrases, it has to apply to all of them. So for example, the proposal would streamline the application process, speed up admission decision, and has proved to save money when implemented by other schools. So what's wrong here? The would verb. When we break up the sentences to check for our good parallel structure, we would have three different sentences. It would start with, the proposal would streamline the application. That's number one. The proposal would speed up admission decisions. That's okay. The proposal would has proved to save money when implemented by other schools. That doesn't work. So what would be better is the proposal would streamline the application process, speed up admission decisions, and save money. So here the three sentences would be: the proposal would streamline the application process. The proposal would speed up admission decisions. And the proposal would save money. You could also break up the sentence. You could also make two sentences if you wanted to. The proposal would streamline the application process and speed up admission decisions, period. It is proved to save money when implemented by other schools. That's also perfectly fine. So now moving to language that can be perceived as bias. Why do we want to avoid a bias-free language? Biased language that's not central to the work often distracts us. Makes us less credible, in theory. Now, if the bias is central to the meaning of the work, you have to include bias in the writing. So, for example, if your article relates to machine learning and bias, there has to be bias. There's probably bias throughout your article. Now, there's a difference between the subject of your writing is bias and the style you're using is biased writing. We want to avoid that to maintain our credibility and to try not to distract the reader. What kind of bias are we talking about? Gender bias is one of the ways we can insert bias in an article. So how do we fix this? We use bias-free language. And this can be tricky, as the Chicago Manual of Style points out, and I agree. Some readers don't like to use or don't like to see a generic masculine version of pronouns. So using he or him in general, when not really focusing on one gender. To some readers, it's unacceptable. Or to some readers, it distracts them. On the other hand, some different readers might find it distracting when you use non-traditional forms of pronouns to avoid the generic. And sometimes we see this as kind of like whenever there's a pronoun, someone might put she/he or s/he, for example, throughout. Some readers might find this distracting as well. Some readers might be distracted by using they, them is a singular pronoun. And we'll talk about kind of some ways to avoid this in general. But just realize like what you might feel is acceptable or what you might feel is not acceptable might be distracting to one reader or another reader, and distracting to the main point of your article or writing. Now, if the main point of your article is to highlight these issues, then you must highlight those issues. But if it's not, and you want your reader to be focused on your specific issue, then it's best to not use this language that would be distracting to a reader. So other biases could be anything. The point here is to just kind of avoid this kind of language that some readers might find offensive or distracting, unless the subject of your article is to do just that. So what are we striving for? And as writers and editors, what are we trying to do? We want to try to find language that doesn't hint at any sense of bias. Unless, for example, you're writing about something like sexism or racism. Then in that situation, you're highlighting the bias. You'll need to use biased language that some might find distracting. Otherwise, if the topic doesn't have anything to do with that, the rule of thumb is to don't even hint at the issue. Now, some techniques that we can use, and this is for gender neutrality. Reword the sentence, omit a pronoun. A lot of times the pronoun is not necessary. So one example that they give in the Chicago Manual of Style, the programmer should update the records when data is transferred to her by the head office. In this sentence, you can just eliminate to her. And you would get, the programmer should update the records when data is transferred by the head office. If there's only one programmer, it can be omitted. We can also repeat the noun. This is particularly important or useful in contract language. Just repeat the noun. So the example they give in the Chicago Manual of Style, a writer should be careful not to needlessly antagonize readers because her credibility would otherwise suffer. You can just maintain and repeat the noun. So for example, a writer should be careful not to needlessly antagonize readers because the writer's credibility would otherwise suffer. That takes care of that. You could use a plural antecedent. When you use plural antecedent, you don't need to use a singular pronoun. So in the English language, that gets rid of the necessity for using a gender-specific pronoun. So for example, the Chicago Manual of Style notes a contestant must conduct himself with dignity at all times. You could write contestants in the plural must conduct themselves with dignity at all times. Perfectly fine. You could use an article instead of a pronoun. So, for example, they give a student accused of cheating must actively waive his right to have his guidance counselor present becomes a student accused of cheating must actively waive the right to have a guidance counselor present. You could use the singular pronoun one. So, for example, an actor in New York is likely to earn more than he is in Pennsylvania. Becomes an actor in New York is likely to earn more than one in Pennsylvania. Than one actor. You could use the relative pronoun who. So the example, employers presume that if an applicant can't write well, he won't be a good employee. Becomes, employers presume that an applicant who can't write well won't be a good employee. And then finally, just revising the sentence. Just kind of figuring out a way to eliminate the gender by rewriting the sentence. This can be done in a number of ways. So gender neutral, singular pronouns. The Chicago Manual Style states that they, their, substituting the plural they and their for the singular he and she is becoming more popular, becoming more common in informal usage, but not totally grammatically correct. So they suggest, they being the Chicago Manual Style, suggest trying to avoid that. And the idea that if some people identify with not using a gender-specific pronoun, honor those wishes or that use. And those preferences should be respected. And finally, sex-specific labels is adjectives. So when gender is relevant, then it's acceptable to use the noun a woman as a modifier. For example, a woman judge. And this is what the Chicago Manual Style states. Female is also acceptable, but sometimes might be considered objectionable by some people. But sometimes when you're talking about male and female, it's acceptable to use male and female adjectives are perfectly fine choices. Again, this is when gender is relevant. So you need to be asking yourself, is gender relevant at this point when using this language? So avoiding other biased language. Again, we need to emphasize when we're talking about people, emphasize the person and not any characteristic. Avoid references to sex, race, ethnicity, disability, age, religion, sexual orientation, etc. Again, when it's not relevant. When it is relevant, or rather when it's important to mention this to develop a personality or picture of the person. The exact quote from the Chicago Manual of Style is, use care. There are situations where painting a picture of a person, it would be helpful to understand these personal characteristics because it is relevant to the reader's understanding. Perfectly fine to use this. Use care. Okay, punctuation. Wrap up with a couple issues relating to punctuation and this idea of serial commas. So items in a series are usually separated by commas. When there are three or more, a comma. When a comma appears before the conjunction of the last element in the series, this is called the Oxford comma or the serial comma. It prevents ambiguity. So let's look at a couple of examples. She posted pictures of her parents, the president, and the vice president. So she posted pictures. If there wasn't a comma before the last and, that would suggest that her parents were the president and the vice president. So we need that comma before the and. So when the last element is consists of a pair joined by and, then you still have the comma before you would still use the serial comma, but leave the last and open. So for example, their wartime rations included cabbage, turnips, comma, and bread and butter. So bread and butter is one element that you don't need a comma in between, but you do before the previous and. As well as, we talked about the use of as well as before. But remember, as well as is not a substitute for and. So, for example, the team had 1 Mazda, 2 Corvettes, and 3 Bugattis, as well as a Toyota. So you would have to have that and before the 3 Bugattis and the comma after Bugatti. So it wouldn't say the team had 1 Mazda, 2 Corvettes, 3 Bugattis, as well as etc. So semicolons with however, therefore, indeed, etc. So when you're using an adverb, when they're joining 2 independent clauses, it should be preceded by a semicolon. Shouldn't use a comma. So this is when you're using however, thus, hence, indeed, accordingly, besides, and therefore. So one example, the accuracy of Jesse's watch was never in question, semicolon. Besides, comma, she was an expert at, etc. Callista was determining not to miss anything on her voyage, semicolon. Accordingly, comma, she made, etc. So that's all I'd like to talk about in this lecture. Thanks, everybody, and take care.